Welcome back to Spirituality 101 at First Congregational. This week, the question is, what's your favorite passage in the Bible? I like how the United Church of Christ approaches this because I came from the old school approach where we just memorize what people told us to memorize. But this is kind of different. This week we're asking, what's your favorite story or passage in the Bible, and why do you think that part of the Bible speaks to you so much? We'd love to hear what in the Bible moves you, and maybe in the comment section, feel free to jot down your favorite book, chapter, verse, and also feel free to explain why those verses are so dear to you if you're so inclined. For me, there's a couple of verses that came to mind right away. And one's the parable of the Good Samaritan. And the other is the story of Jesus talking to the Samaritan woman at the well. For some reason, both of these stories involve Samaritans, and they speak to me. But honestly, I don't know much about Samaritans. I just know that the Jews looked down on them for some reason. So I decided this week to do a little research to try to understand what's going on here. What I found is fascinating to me. From the outside, Jews and Samaritans seemed very similar. They both claimed to have the same ancestors, Abraham and Moses. They both came from the same part of the world. They both held a belief that the first 5 books of the Bible, the Pentateuch, were central to their faith. The Samaritans say that Joseph, the great-grandson of Abraham, granted his 2 sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, the fertile land that would become Samaria. After King Solomon died in 930 BCE, the nation of Israel split into a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom. The northern kingdom was called Israel, I believe, and the southern was called Judah. The Samaritans were located in the northern kingdom. It's interesting that Samaria was only 35 miles from Jerusalem. So even though the successive empires of the Assyrians, Babylonians, Persians, Greeks, and Romans were bad to the Jews, the ones who really kind of bothered the Jews were the Samaritans, who lived just down the road and were very similar to them. The northern kingdom was taken over in 722 BCE by the Assyrians, which meant that the Samaritans were forced to have contact with a diverse group of people, and they adopted some of the practices of their occupiers, and they intermarried with some of those foreigners. And the Jews to the south, who were not yet forced to live among foreigners, looked down on the Samaritans for their intermarriage and their assimilation with these outsiders. And they justified their criticism of these Samaritans because Moses was clear about intermarrying with outside tribes. He wasn't for it. But then around 600 BCE, Judah fell to the Babylonians, and the Jewish people were forced into exile and lived among a different people. And over the course of centuries, these southerners, who were so critical of intermarriage and assimilation of the northerners in the beginning, ended up doing the same thing. According to the Encyclopedic Dictionary of the Bible, Louise Hartman says that the Samaritans probably had as much pure Jewish blood as the Jews who later returned from the Babylonian exile. So it seems that one of the things that Jews hated the most about the Samaritans is one of the things they themselves were guilty of. But that didn't stop the Jews from looking down on the Samaritans. According to John Rittenbaugh at BibleTools.org, by Jesus' day, Samaritans were considered like mongrel dogs. They were looked at as mutts, both racially and religiously. And back then, a reference to a dog was particularly low because dogs were not beloved like they are today. And this attitude towards Samaritans made its way into the scriptures. Many of the books of the Old Testament were written by people of the southern kingdom of Judah. And these writers criticized the northern tribe. And many of them were Samaritans for adopting the practices. So they were criticized for adopting the practices of intermarrying with these foreigners. According to written by Kings, by 2 Kings 17:35 to 38, in those verses, the Samaritans were no longer considered a part of the covenant between God and Israel, which makes me wonder if that's why the Samaritans only accepted the first 5 books of the Bible. Who'd want to read anything where people like you are portrayed as sellouts and half-breeds, and even moreover, a people who are no longer a part of the covenant of God? Allison Camille, who writes for the U.S. Catholic Magazine, points out that many of our most beloved prophets, Amos, Isaiah, Hosea, Ezekiel, and Micah, had nothing good to say about the people from Samaria. For instance, the prophet Nehemiah tells us in chapter 13, verses 28 and 29, that the grandson of the high priest, Eliashib, married the daughter of a Samaritan governor. Her name was Sanballat, and she was a worshiper of Yahweh. Nehemiah had both of them banished from Jerusalem. So in defiance of Jerusalem's banishment, Sanballat's dad built a temple on Mount Gerizim, so his son-in-law, Eliashib, could be a high priest there. And even though there was bad blood between the Jews and Samaritans all along, this event was that straw that broke the camel's back here and split those two peoples forever. It's interesting that the prophet Nehemiah was famous for building walls around Jerusalem. I'm just venture a guess that he justified building those walls to keep those foreign invaders like the Assyrians and the Babylonians and the Persians out. But I also wonder how upset Nehemiah was that these walls might also keep out Samaritans. And given how he treated Eliashib and Sanballat, I don't think he would have been too upset. In fact, he may have had some valid concerns regarding the Samaritans, because according to Pat McCloskey, the disgruntled Samaritans tried to secretly sabotage the rebuilding of Jerusalem after the fall to the Babylonians. So the dislike between Samaritans and Jews was mutual. Alice Camille says that we should keep in mind that the folks on both sides of the border claimed Abraham as their father and Moses as their liberator, and they all worshiped the God of Jacob. They're all children of Israel. Initially, their differences were political. This is key. Initially, their differences were political, but they became cultural. And as time apart rendered these two kingdoms increasingly estranged from each other. I don't know if I said that very good, but initially their differences were political, but then eventually they became cultural, and those never did heal. The Judeans who had endured 500 years of trauma at the hands of the Babylonians and Persians and Greeks, eventually the Romans, were defensive and protectionistic behind Nehemiah's walls. By the time Jesus came around, the most offensive thing that an outsider could do was to confuse a Jew with a Samaritan. To the first century Jews, Samaritans represented everything that had gone wrong with Judaism. The Jewish mindset towards Samaritans was something like they're a bunch of sellouts and chameleons who change color with every passing empire. We, at least, stand true to our beliefs. And it's here that I start to understand a little better how shocking it must have been for Jews who heard Jesus tell stories of Samaritan heroes or saw him talking to Samaritans. 1,000 years of tension built up, where even some of the most holy, revered, and respected people from the Jewish faith said bad things about the Samaritans. And that must have given them license to also go along with their hatred toward the Samaritans. Hating them must have seemed justifiable, because if Amos and Micah and Isaiah could speak poorly of the Samaritan people, then so could the rest of the Jewish people. And in fact, if the ancestors of the Jewish people hated Samaritans, then it must have seemed like a natural part of the Jewish identity to hate Samaritans. And this goes on unchecked for centuries. And then this guy named Jesus comes along and makes Samaritans the heroes of his stories. That doesn't even sound Jewish. He's beyond unprecedented. He's downright sacrilegious.
What are you telling me?
I'm talking about the Samaritan people. Do you remember that story this week with the 10 lepers and Jesus healed one? One of those was a Samaritan who came back to say thank you. Did you tell anyone thank you?
Rafi, thank you.
Aw, go tell Rafi thank you. And go tell Mama thank you too. So anyway, I mean, he was betraying some of the very things that make us Jewish, right? So why does that story move me? I don't know. I see our country coming apart. And within this history of divisiveness between the division between the Jews and the Samaritans, I see many parallels to where we are today. Just as the Jews and the Samaritans must have seemed so similar to anyone in the outside, so too Democrats and Republicans both look very similar from the outside. And just as the Samaritans and the Jews both laid claim to the same ancestors, Abraham and Moses, so too people on both sides of the divide in this country claim the same ancestors, George Washington and Abraham Lincoln. And just as the Jews came from the same part of the world, so too people from both political parties in this country come from the same part of North America. And just like both Samaritans and Jews revered certain documents like the Pentateuch and the Torah as central to their identity, so too both parties ascribe to the importance of those same documents, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. The split between Samaritans and Jews is really archetypal. It's an archetypal split that people have always faced with others who are the most like them. Today, most people on the outside wouldn't be able to grasp the inner division we hold toward people of the other political party. I think it's worth noting that it's already.
I'm gonna lose it today.
Okay. I think it's worth noting how Alice Camille points out that the initial division between the Jews and the Samaritans, between the Jews and I like how she points out that they were initially just merely political divisions, but over time they became cultural, and that kind of deep division never went away, which makes me pause. We see how we've always had political differences with those from the other party, but now they're becoming cultural. Both sides now look to the other side and say, what is wrong with those people? And really, it's just another version of the Jew versus Samaritan divide, 21st century style. So while I love how Jesus can say such profound things in short phrases like, love your neighbor as yourself, I love how he heals people, especially the ear of that guy who unjustly arrested him. I love how he goes off to pray in quiet contemplation, but also stays busy in the mix of humanity. I love how he is a servant leader and washes his disciples' feet. All of that. I love that. But for some reason, I always go back to Jesus at the well with the Samaritan woman. I think it's because humanity has always lived in that small tribal mentality, us versus them. Humanity has always been able to justify its hatred of those other people and play games of hierarchy and where we have to put others down to put ourselves up. And here comes this guy, Jesus, who talks in the parable of the Good Samaritan and walks by visiting with that Samaritan woman at the well. He walks and talks this radical new path for humanity. To me, it's the thing that I feel in my guts is right. It's what I feel is the most Jesus thing about Jesus. not in my head, but in my heart. It's those times when Jesus loves the ones who we've been told to hate. And that's when I feel and I know that the true spirit of Jesus is present. And no matter what side we come down on in the divide between Democrats and Republicans, liberals or conservatives, if it doesn't come down on the side of love, then it's not Jesus. The love of the one who loves us is tribal. That's the old, worn out way we've always done it. But love the one who hates us? Well, that's the rub. There's the thing upon which the world starts to change. Lorne Isley wrote, "The great synthesizer who alters the outlook of a generation, who suddenly produces a kaleidoscope of change in our visions of the world, is apt to be the most envied, feared, and hated man among his contemporaries. Almost by instinct, they feel in him the seed of a new order. They sense, even as they anathematize him, the passing away of the sane, substantial world they have long inhabited. Such a man is a kind of lens or a gathering point through which past thought gathers, is reorganized, and radiates outward into new forms." Jesus was one of those type of people. There was a seed in him for something dramatically new. It shattered the old bitter rivalries between the Jews and the Samaritans. And that's not a little thing. I love the path of Jesus that questions and challenges the long-standing divisions. I see our ultimate role in society is not to define who we are and where we stand on every issue, nor is it to win debates against those about how we're right and they're wrong. I'm sure the Jewish people could have found all kinds of reasons to support their dislike of the Samaritans, and some of those reasons may have come from very respectable places like Moses, Isaiah, and Amos. But finding ways to justify our dislike of others is just more of that same old tribal affiliation stuff that divides our world. Jesus took that apart by saying there's something that transcends all this tribal division, and it's love. And if we've been taught to hate, well, can't we be taught to love as well? That's all I got this week. We'll be back next week. Till then, would love to hear what what's your favorite verse and why does you think it moves you? So hope to see you in those comment sections. Take care. Peace.